This week's parsha, Parshas Mishpatim, and I'd like to speak about a technical point. The Chazal say the Ein Mukdum Mukdum B'Torah. The Torah is not in strict chronological order. Rashi is willing to invoke this principle even where it is not explicitly mentioned in Chazal. The Ramban, as a rule, takes the position that we should try to understand the parashas as being in chronological order, unless Chazal explicitly tell us that is not the case. Now, in last week's parsha, we have the Maimed Har Sinai, we have the revelation of Har Sinai, the giving of the Aseres Dibros, and this is followed by supplementary information in the end of last week's parsha about several of the Ten Commandments, which continues into this week's parsha. At the end of this week's parsha, we have HaKadosh Baruch Hu giving instructions to Moshe Rabbeinu, Alei al Hashem, to ascend the mountain and to receive the rest of the Torah. The Ramban understands that the Psukim are in historical chronological order, meaning that the end of Parshas Yisro and the first three chapters of Parshas Mishpatim were given before Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Har Sinai to receive the rest of the Torah. Rashi understands that the parsha is out of order, that the last chapter of Parshas Mishpatim really should be at the end of Parshas Yisro, and Parshas Mishpatim was said to Moshe Rabbeinu when he was on Har Sinai. That's the position of Rashi. But let's take the Ramban's position for a moment. Because Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Har Sinai to receive the rest of the Torah. And yet, there was some information that was so pressing that it couldn't wait. It couldn't wait for Moshe to go up and spend 40 days in the mountain to bring it back down. HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to give this information to Moshe Rabbeinu while he was still at the foot of the mountain. And only after that did he tell Moshe to ascend the mountain to receive the rest of the Torah. And according to the Ramban, that includes the Mishpatim. The body of civil law, criminal law, which is the central theme of our parsha, according to the Ramban, was given to Moshe Rabbeinu before he ascended the mountain to receive the rest of the Torah. That means it couldn't wait. Then Moshe Rabbeinu was going to be in the mountain for 40 days, and he was going to learn the entire Torah, but this could not wait. This had to be given to Moshe Rabbeinu and in turn transmitted to the Bnei Yisrael before Moshe would go up the mountain. So apparently this is very, very pressing. The Mishpatim, the tort law, contract law, civil law, criminal law, this have to be given right away. According to Rashi, we don't see that. According to Rashi, the parashas are out of order, and Parshas Mishpatim was said after Moshe went up to Har Sinai. The last chapter of Mishpatim really comes before the first three chapters of Mishpatim. But according to the Ramban, the parasha is in strict chronological order. That means that this parasha was given to Moshe Rabbeinu before he ascended the mountain for the 40 days to receive the rest of the Torah. Because it was apparently very pressing that this information be transmitted. Why is it so pressing? I'd like to offer a conjecture that the Mishpatim become particularly relevant after the Yetzias Mitzrayim in the way that they weren't beforehand. Let me explain. Because we know that Mitzrayim was a slave nation. Not only the Jews were slaves, everybody was a slave. There was only one free man in Mitzrayim, and that was Paro. How that came to be, interestingly, according to the Torah, was through the agency of Yosef. There was a famine in Mitzrayim, and Yosef had cornered the market on food, and he basically said that you have to pay. So the first year people ran out of money, and then they surrendered their livestock, and then their land, and finally they sold themselves as slaves. And if anything, Yosef was a benevolent master. He only insisted on a 20% tax, 4/5 the farmers keep for themselves, but 20% they had to pay. That was the Pharaoh's share, but he really was entitled to everything because he was the master. I think I mentioned once upon a time the Meshech Chochmah, who makes an intriguing point in this basis. You know, the Gemara tells us in Parak Chelek that years after the Yetzias Mitzrayim, there was a litigation in front of Alexander the Great. The Egyptians came and they said that, listen, the Jews walked out with all the wealth of the country and they have to give it back. They have to give it back. So Alexander the Great heard the Egyptians' argument, and he asked the Jews if they had a defense. And the Jews said, well, these were the wages of our years of enslavement. Because we were slaves, really that was unjustified. We should have been paid. So all the gold and silver and clothing that we took, that was our wage. And the Egyptians conceded. They said that we have no response to that argument. Points out to Meshech Chochmah that there is a very good response they could have offered. Because according to Chazal, the Jews were slaves to whom? To Paro. Right? They weren't slaves of private Egyptians, they were slaves to the regime. And we say that in Haggadah, Avodim hoyinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh. We weren't slaves to the Egyptian people. We were slaves to the government. So when the Jews borrowed the gold, I say borrowed in quotation marks, when they took the gold and silver and the clothing from their neighbors and friends, how could that be considered payment for their enslavement? I mean, they were working for Paro. You can't collect your wages from other people. So the Meshech Chochmah explains that it was justified because as a consequence of Yosef's dealings, everybody in Egypt was a slave. And the rule of slavery is Mashakana Eved, Kana Rabo. That which the slave takes possession of belongs to the master. So Paro owned all the property of Egypt, all the gold, all the silver, all the clothing, all the land, everything belonged to Paro. So if Paro owes you money, you can collect it from anybody. You can collect it from your next door neighbor. Why? Because your next door neighbor's assets really belong to Paro too. So you can collect it from wherever you want. But this is what the Meshech Chochmah says, that the entire nation was a slave nation. Everything they owned belonged to Paro. By the way, it's very interesting. What does the word Paro mean? At least in Lashon HaKodesh. Paro, Parua, means unrestrained. It means free. So the king of Egypt was called Paro. He was the only one who was Parua. The only person in the nation who was unrestrained was Paro. No one else was free. Everyone else was a slave. When you think about it for a moment, if everyone is a slave, so that means Paro owns everything, there's no need for Mishpatim. Whereas Mishpatim, civil law, only becomes relevant when you have at least two people who have property rights. So now the question is that if we have a controversy, so who wins? But if everything belongs to one person, there's no need for Mishpatim. You don't need any law, you don't need any litigation, you don't need anything. Whatever the owner says goes. So if Paro will tell you, your gold, give to him, and your silver, give to him, and the clothing share, and the food is divided this way, that's his prerogative, it's all his. You don't need Mishpatim in that case. In such a state, everything can be settled by the whim of the master. So where does the idea of civil law begin? It begins with emancipation, with liberation. When you have individuals who are free, who have the rights to property, now the question is, how do you settle disputes? You have rights, he has rights, she has rights, they have rights, everyone has rights, and undoubtedly there's going to be some controversy. This person damaged this person stole from this person borrowed money he didn't pay. So how do you resolve those disputes? That's how we have Mishpatim. But there was no need for Mishpatim within Klal Yisrael before the liberation. Everything belonged to Paro. Everything belongs to Paro. So you have a difference of opinion. Ask Paro, what do you want? Whatever Paro says goes. Paro is represented by his entourage, staff. But once you have the Yetzias Mitzrayim, now there is liberation, so now we have the beginning of property rights. Now we have to have Mishpatim. And that's undoubtedly why you couldn't wait. You see, there was no law that was practiced in the interim. It wasn't that in Egypt they had Mishpatim, which they could have used to tide themselves over until Moshe would come down from Har Sinai. This was something critical. There was no law. There was no law in force. There was no law in practice. So therefore, Moshe couldn't disappear for 40 days. Who knows what would happen? So therefore, the Mishpatim had to be given immediately. And that's the Ramban Shita, that before Moshe went up for the 40 days, he received the Mishpatim and passed them on. It couldn't wait. There was an urgency. Because until this point, there was anarchy. There was no concept of Mishpat. Only with freedom was the concept of Mishpat introduced. Now this might explain something very difficult. Let's crystallize this idea. That Mishpatim, the idea of civil law, criminal law, is rooted in the idea of emancipation, of freedom, goes a long way to explaining the very first Mishpat that is discussed, which is the law of the Eved Ivri. Now this is a very, very curious thing, because we would have thought that the law of the Eved Ivri is a detail within the law of property. There are laws that pertain to property, land, other forms of property. So slaves is one aspect of the law of property. It certainly shouldn't be the first thing mentioned in the list of Mishpatim. If for some reason the law of Ivri is listed first, and the Ramban is troubled by this, and the Ramban says because the law of the Eved Ivri touches upon religious ideas as well. Because the first law of the Eved Ivri, that he works for 6 years and he goes free in the 7th, really is reminiscent of the idea of Shabbos. The same way that we work 6 days and we rest in the 7th, it reminds us of the fact that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, sanctified the Shabbos. So the law of the Eved Ivri working 6 years and going free in the 7th corresponds to that. And therefore, it is a very important mishpat. It's a mishpat nichbat, he says. It's a very, very honored law because it alludes to a religious principle. And we once quoted this Ramban. We explained that what the Ramban is getting at is to tell us that in Judaism there is no strict separation of church and state. Because it isn't that there's one realm of religion and another realm of law, and the two have no overlap. The two do not impact one another. Because even our mishpatim, even our civil law, our criminal law, our property law, also reflect aspects of our religious law. So the law of the Eved, which is part of the law of property, alludes to the idea of the 6 days of creation, Shabbos. Therefore, the Ramban says that's why it's put first. It's to affirm this idea that to a Jew, the Mishpatim are not something which is divorced from religious belief. It really is part and parcel of our religious principles. Okay, that's what the Ramban says. But I think there's another idea over here, which is really a very important lesson about freedom. You see, the Mishpatim, as we said, they only come into play because the Jews have been free. And therefore the Ribono Shel Olam wants to give a lesson about freedom. Freedom is something which has to be cherished. And you surrender your freedom at your own peril. Now let's explore the halachas that are mentioned over here. It says that you buy an Eved Ivri, so he works for 6 years, goes free in the 7th. It says, Im bigapo yavo, if he comes alone, bigapo yetze, he goes out alone. And from here we learn a very, very interesting halacha, which is that if the Eved was married, the master now becomes obligated to feed and support the family of the Eved. Presumably the Eved, now that he's working 24/7, cannot maintain his own family. So the master of the Eved takes over the responsibility for the family of the Eved. Now this is a very fascinating thing the Ramban himself points out, because we hold that the obligation to feed your wife is only midrabanan. Ramban holds, based on the Gemara and Ksubas, that mezainis is the rabbanan. There is no biblical obligation for a husband to provide for his wife. Because in theory, the deraisa view of marriage, it would be possible to have a marriage that would have no financial entanglements. Because you wouldn't be obligated to commingle the funds and pool them together financially. Whereas they could have a prenuptial agreement, and the husband would be financially independent, the wife would be financially independent, and that would be a marriage of sorts. So the obligation of mizonos, the obligation that a husband has to support his wife, the Ramban says only midrabanan. Rashi argues in that. Rashi and the Rambam hold that mizonos are daraisa, but the Ramban, based on the Gemara, says we have conclusive proof that mizonos are drabanan. Yet, he says, it certainly was customary, even though it wasn't obligatory, it was customary for husbands to support their wives, and therefore, when the master buys the Eved, he takes over that customary obligation. So it's interesting, even though the husband himself wasn't obligated, the master buys the Eved, he becomes obligated to support the family. So it says, if he comes in alone, then he leaves alone. In Bal Ishahu, if he was married to a woman, the Yotze Ishto Imo. So when he leaves at the end of the 6 years, his wife goes out with him. Meaning they come in to the master's household, but at the end of the 6 years they leave together. Now, Im Adonav Yitin Lo Isha. What if the master gives him a wife? And what's the intention of the master? The master figures that he's my slave. He's obligated to work 24/7. I'll put him to work breeding children. So I will give him a woman, and Chazal said this means a shivcha knanes. It's a Gentile maidservant, and he will be put to work to breed children. V'yod lo vanim uvanos. And what happens if they have children? Ha'isha v'lodeha tiyal aruneha. The woman and her children, they remain the property of the master. He leaves us end of 6 years, but the shivcha, the Gentile maidservant, remains behind. A Gentile maidservant doesn't go free in 6 years. A Jewish maidservant does. That halacha of 6 years applies to an Oma Ivriya as well, to a Jewish maidservant. But a Gentile maidservant remains enslaved forever. So when he's emancipated at the end of 6 years, the wife and her children remain behind in the possession of the master. And he goes out alone. Now, what happens if during his term of duty, he took a liking to his master, to this woman, children? If the servant says, I like my master. My wife, my children, I don't want to go free. I don't want to go free after 6 years, leave behind my new family. So there's a procedure. The master brings him to the court. And he's brought to the door post. And the master pierces his ear, and he becomes a slave forever. And Chazal say forever doesn't really mean forever, it only means till Yovel, which could be as good as forever, because it may be as long as 50 years. If it's closer to Yovel, it'll be less, but it could be as much as 50 years. And this way, he doesn't leave the family. What is the significance of the piercing of the ear? So Rashi says like this. Rashi says that a Jew should not want to be a slave. The pasuk says, "Ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim." We are meant to be slaves to Hashem, not to be slaves to human beings. So the ear that heard this teaching, "Ki li b'nei Yisrael avodim," and chose to extend his term of duty permanently. We're not talking about the initial enslavement. When a person chooses to be a slave for 6 years, that's like a work contract. That's not considered a real enslavement. But if a person enslaves himself seemingly forever until Yovel, that already is a violation of the principle of Kili B'nai Yisrael Avadim. So the ear that heard this teaching is pierced as a mark, as if to say that you heard this lesson and you didn't absorb it, so we make a mark on your ear. It's interesting that from the Torah it seems that a pierced ear is a negative mark. Nowadays I think it's fashionable. I don't know how that changed, but at least then it was considered a black mark on the person. Now, what's really going on in this parsha is really this. The Torah is telling us something very, very deep. What you create yourself is yours. It can't be taken away from you. If as a free man you establish a relationship, you marry, you have a family, that can never be taken away from you. You can sell yourself as a slave for a time, but at the end of the term, at the end of the 6 years, v'yatla ishto imo, his wife, if there are children, the children, they go free with him. Something which is your own cannot be taken away from you. The fact that in the interim you were a slave, that's only for 6 years. After the 6 years, the family leaves. But something which is given to you within the context of slavery, if the master gives you a wife, that's always his. That's always his. Something which you did not earn, something which you did not create, something which is the benefit provided by the master, it's his. And you can never take it with you. At the end of the 6 years, you know, the woman and her children remain with the master. You can go free. But you have to leave everything behind. You want it, if you say, but I love her. I love my master. I love my wife. I love my children. I don't want to go free. So if you want to enjoy the benefits you received as a slave, there's only one solution, which is to remain a slave. And the Torah gives you the option. Because you can't take it with you. That which you receive as a slave belongs to the master. Since you want to continue to enjoy it, you can sign up for a longer term of duty. Yes?
That master can take away that given wife at any point, no? In other words, he signs up for forever, and all of a sudden, a year later or whatever.
It doesn't seem like that. It doesn't seem that he can take her away. Or they're considered married. But it's not like Uncle Tom's Cabin, where they can separate the families. No, they're considered married. If he leaves, then you have the situation. He's a free man, she's still a slave, so they part ways. But as long as he's a slave, it seems that the master doesn't have the right to take her away from him. But this is the idea. The idea is that you have to cherish your freedom, right? If you seek the benefits of enslavement, you may find yourself in a situation that the only eitzah, the only way you can continue to enjoy those fruits of enslavement is to commit yourself for a longer term. And that is not what a Jew should do. Right? A Jew is meant to be free. Free means he's meant to be able to chart his own course in life. He's not meant to submit to the will of another human being. And that's the tragedy of the slave whose ear is pierced. This is a very important thing to lay down at the beginning of the parsha of Mishpatim. Because if we're talking about Mishpatim being a consequence of freedom, then we have to understand freedom is not something which just happens. Freedom is something that has to be preserved, it has to be maintained, it has to be nurtured, and a person can lose it. And sometimes a person can even voluntarily surrender it. And that's why right at the outset, we don't begin with the laws of murder or the laws of loans or the laws of torts. We begin with this law of the Eved, because since the whole introduction to Mishpatim is the idea of liberation, so this is a relevant theme in the beginning. I want to point out that the Orach Chaim, in his commentary, you may know if you ever studied Orach Chaim, takes many parshias, many sections of the Torah that are legalistic, and he explains them b'derech remez, in the manner of hint, as an allusion to mystical and spiritual concepts. In this parsha as well, the Orach Chaim says, the parsha has no meaning. Of course, everything we said is true. It refers to a slave, and it refers to a slave who goes free after 6 years, and it refers to a slave who wants to extend his term. We're not denying the simple reading of the verse. But there's also a second interpretation of the verse, which is in the way of remez, the way of allusion or allegory, to allude to spiritual ideas. He points out that a human being is comprised of two halves. A human being has a guf, has a body, and has a neshama, and has a soul. Now, from the Jewish perspective, what is the essential part of the human being? Is the neshama, is the soul. It says the body is an accessory. The body is a tool. But the essential person is the neshama, the life force, the soul. So a soul, a disembodied soul, can't function, can't do what it's meant to do. So we are given an accessory to serve us, to enable the soul to fulfill its desires, and that's the guf. So he writes, Kisikne Eved Ivri, when you acquire an Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, this is a reference to the neshama, the soul, acquiring a body. At conception and birth, the neshama acquires a body. And that's what it refers to. Kisikne Eved Ivri, when the neshama acquires the body. And he points out a very interesting thing. Why it's called an Eved Ivri? Now this is a question commentaries struggle with. Why is the Hebrew slave called Eved Ivri? Now the word Ivri is not a word which is used much in the Torah. Except in this context of slaves. Other than with regards to slaves, we don't find the word Ivri used, except once Avraham Avinu is called Avraham HaIvri. Hebrew is a rough transliteration of Ivri. So why is here the word Ivri used? Well, the Mefarshim point out, because it would have said Eved Yisrael, a Jewish slave. But Yisrael is a title of distinction, it's a title of honor, and therefore it's not appropriate to apply to a person who has enslaved himself. Okay, so we use the backup word Ivri. But the Orach Chaim says a very interesting thing. The word Ivri is related to the Hebrew word over. Over means fleeting, passing. Something which is transitory. It's passing. It isn't permanent. It says the body in relation to the soul is over. It's temporary. The soul is nitzchi. The soul is eternal. It pre-exists the body. It lives on beyond the death of the body. The body is temporary, it's fleeting. Therefore it's an Eved Ivri, it's a passing, temporary slave. Kisikne Eved Ivri. So the body is now put to work. It's put to work for the soul. For how long? Now what is considered a lifespan of a human being? What is considered a normal lifespan? So the Gemara says that a normal lifespan is 60 years. That's what that means. The Gemara says if you live to 70, that's considered seva. That's considered advanced age. If you live to 80, that's considered really long age. It says, but a full life is 60. If a person lived till 60, it's considered he lived a full life. That's why the Gemara says that Misa Bidei Shamayim is before 60. As a person is liable for heavenly death because of an Aveira, he'll die before the age of 60. If he dies before 50, that's Kares. It's even worse. But Misa Bidei Shamayim is before 60. 60, a person dies at 60. And Chazal's thinking, the Mormon Cotton says, that's considered he lived out his full life. You wouldn't say that was a premature death. at 60. Maybe nowadays we don't think that way. But the Gemara says that 60 was considered a full life. It's interesting, though, in the Midbar, when the Jews were in the Midbar, and they committed the Chet HaMeraglim, so Hashem decreed that they be wiped out. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu did not want to make a Chilul Hashem, so he kept the Jews in the Midbar for 40 years, so that even the Jews who were 20, they would die at 60. According to Chazal, no one died below 60. Everyone that died in the Midbar died at the age of 60. So it took 40 years until the people who were just 20 reached the age of 60. So how did that avoid the Chilul Hashem? Because the Chilul Hashem would have been, well, God took them out of Egypt and killed them prematurely. But if everyone lived till 60, everyone lived a full life. So when it says Sheish Shanim Ya'avod, that the slave shall work for 6 years, 6 is an allusion to 60. The Rabbi points out that 6 and 60 really are the same. It's only that in the one case, the 6 is in the units place. In the other case, the 6 is in the 10th place. I think we talked about the 0 last week. That the 0 just is the placeholder to tell you that the 6 is one place over. The 6 and 60 really are the same. And therefore, Sheish Shanim Ya'avod is an allusion to the 60 years. Uvashviyis, and in the 7th year or the 7th decade, then the person goes free. In what sense does a person go free? The Chazal say, Lamesim Chavshi. When a person dies, he's Chavshi min ha-mitzvahs, he's free from obligations. The person is only obligated to mitzvahs as long as he lives. Once he reaches that point, he is now free. So this is an allusion to the life cycle of the human being. Now, is that the end? When a person dies, is that the end of his life? Because we know there's a Tchias HaMeisa. We know there's a resurrection of the dead. And what are you resurrected with? When you come back to life, what are you resurrected with? What achievements, what merit do you have? So you have the schuyos, you have the merit of your previous life. Because if your first time around, you learned Torah, you did mitzvahs, so when you are resurrected with that merit. The life you will enjoy will be a function of the merit that you accrued your first time around. So it says here like this, Im begapo yavo begapo yetze. Now literally it means if you came alone, then you leave alone. But begapo is a very curious word. The Hebrew word we would have expected is the word livado. Livado, alone. So what does Rashi say, begapo? Rashi says, begapo means bekanfo. It means you came with the corner of your garment. If you came with the corner of your garment, then you leave with the corner of your garment. I mean, if you came with the clothes in your back, you leave with the clothes in your back. But the word gapo, Rashi says, means a kanaf. Now, a kanaf, in addition to meaning a corner of a garment, means something else. What does it mean? A kanaf is a wing. A wing, a bird's wing is a kanaf. Now, the two are related because the wing of the bird is like a garment. The bird holds its wings by its side, so it's like a garment. But in the sense of a wing, it means like this. Think, what are wings a metaphor for? The Gemara says in Masechah Shabbos that why are the Jewish people compared to a dove? It says just like a dove, knafeha magina isoleha, her wings protect it. So Klal Yisrael as well, Torah and mitzvahs protect the Jew. And therefore, Begapo, with his wing, is a reference to your mitzvahs. So he reads it this way, the Ohr HaChaim, in Begapo Yavo, if you went to the grave with your mitzvahs, Begapo Yetze, you will leave the grave with your mitzvahs. Meaning, when it comes time for the Tchias HaMesim, what do you bring with you? You bring with you what you achieved the first time around. Now again, the purpose of the Tchias HaMesim is to come back in a better time and to accrue more zchuyos, more merit, more Torah, more mitzvahs. But in the meantime, what is your starting point? You start with what you earned the first time around. Okay? You don't want to come back to the Tchias HaMesim, starting at the end of the pack. So you want to get a head start. So that's in Begat Lo Yavo. If you went to the grave with your wings, you will leave the grave with your wings. Now, in Baal Ishahu, what does this mean? If you are the husband of a woman, V'yatza Ishto Imo, your wife will come out with you. Now this, the Ohr HaChaim explains, this is a little mystical. Let me explain, this is Al Pi Kabbalah. The Zohar says a fascinating thing. The Zohar says there's a difference between an animal and a human being. Very fundamental difference. It says in the Pasuk, Shor o Kesev o Eis ki Yivoled. If an ox or a sheep or a goat is born, then the halach is as follows. So the Zohar points out, it doesn't say if a calf is born. It doesn't say if a lamb is born. It doesn't say if a kid is born. It says if an ox is born, if a fully grown sheep is born, if a goat is born. And the Chazal point this out in the Gemara. And the Chazal say, you see from here, that Shor ben Yom will kari Shor. That a newborn calf is called a Shor. It's called a full-fledged ox. Now, as soon as it's born. So what's the significance of that? The Zohar says that in the case of an animal, there is growth, but there's no real unexpected development. Meaning, whatever the shore ultimately will be is already contained in the genome of the calf. There's nothing that it has to learn. There's nothing that it has to achieve. This is what it is, it is. Like, obviously, it has to get a little bigger and grow, but there's no life skills that it learns. There are no nisyonos that it overcomes. It says, whatever it is, it is. A human being is not that way, says the Zohar. A human being goes through life. There is no inevitability to the human being's full development. The person may not. But the Zohar goes a step further. It says a fantastic thing. It says that even your neshama is incomplete when you come to the world. That when you learn Torah and you do mitzvahs, you are granted higher elements of neshama. Now the Zohar says that there are 5 parts of the neshama. There's nefesh, and there's ruach, and there's neshama, and there's chaya and yechida. There are 5 parts of the neshama. You are born with one. You are born with nefesh. Zacha, if a person merits, then he earns the portion called ruach. If he merits furthermore, he gets the portion called neshama. You merit furthermore, you get the portion which is called chaya. You merit more than that, you get the chayla called yechida. That means that it's not just you do mitzvahs. Your neshama actually expands. And the Ohr HaChaim says, it brings us from the Zohar also, that when it says Baal Isha, if you are the husband of a woman, that means if through your efforts you've achieved parts of the neshama which you were not born with. So you are a Baal Isha, you are the husband of a woman, meaning in the same way that when a husband marries a wife, so this is something which is new, hasn't been with him from the very beginning. So likewise, if you've incorporated elements of the neshama into your being through your learning Torah, through your doing of mitzvahs, then that becomes part of your neshama. And it's not only yours for the duration of your life, but when the time of the Tchias HaMesim comes, v'yatza ishto imo, that when you come out of the grave, you'll come out with that extra neshama. Why? Because you earned it. You earned it in your lifetime. So when a person dies, and he's resurrected, Tchias Amesim, V'yatza Ishto, that neshama that he earned in his first time around, he will have in the second time around. But says the Orach Chaim, this is a frightening thing. He says sometimes a person is given a lofty neshama which he did not work for. He did not work for. So why was he given to him? Let's say, for example, God needed this person to fulfill some important function in the world. And to be able to fulfill that function, he needed a very lofty neshama. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him the gift of this lofty neshama. And it wasn't his because he earned it. It was given him as a gift. So, for the duration of his lifetime, he has it, he uses it, hopefully he uses it well. But what happens when it comes time to the Tchias HaMesim? He doesn't get it back. Because it's not his. It's not his. He didn't earn it. It was given to him. So the things that are given to you, there's no entitlement. You're not guaranteed to have them forever. So as long as you hear the first time around, says the Orach Chaim, you'll have that lofty neshama. But the second time around, when the person is come to Tchias HaMesim, ha'isha v'lodeha, that woman, meaning that neshama, and her offspring, meaning the merit of all the mitzvahs that were done because of that lofty neshama, they'll belong to the Ribono Shel Olam. V'hu yetei begapo. He will come out of the grave only with the mitzvahs that were done with the neshama that was his. Now, let's understand. That means it's like this. Something that you worked for, something that you achieved on your own, can't be taken away from you. But something that you were only able to achieve because God gave you this special gift of this neshama, it's not yours. It's not yours. So in the meantime, you have it. But by the Tchias HaMesim, you don't have that.
How do you separate it?
How does he separate it? I assume he knows how, right? But the idea is like this. In other words, let's say there are things that you do using the original resources which you were given. So that's yours, right? But something you do only because you have this extra neshama that was given to you, which you didn't earn. So whatever is done through the agency of that neshama is not really yours. You don't rise with the Tchias HaMesim with it. That's a frightening thing. Then he goes on, and he says the following. He says, what happens if the person says, I like my master, I like my wife, I like my children, I don't want to go free? So the Orach Chaim says an amazing pshat over here. He says like this. Now, Olam Haba. What do you think? Olam Haba is good? You think people like Olam Haba? There was once an old lady who I heard saying that the Olam Haba must be pretty good because no one has ever come back to complaining. But the truth is, let me tell you an amazing thing the Chazal say. Chazal say like this. Chazal say, Yafe shah achas shel keres ruach b'olam haba. That one moment of pleasure in olam haba is greater mikol chai olam hazeh, than all the pleasures of this world. And Rav Dessler explains the Maimer as follows. Imagine if you could take all the enjoyable things you've experienced in your life, all the good meals you've eaten and all the fun things you've done and all the interesting places you visited, and you could take all that pleasure and compress it into a single moment of pleasure. All the pleasure of your life. Now, do the same for every other person that ever lived in this world and ever will live in this world. And take all that pleasure and condense it into a single moment of pleasure. That is the sum total of the pleasures of Olam Hazeh. It's not the sum pleasures of my Olam Hazeh. It's the pleasure of everybody's Olam Hazeh put together. Now imagine what it would be like to experience that pleasure. What would happen if you would experience that intense pleasure, all the pleasures of Olam Hazeh put together, your heart would give out. Imagine if I would give you here's an electric live wire, 50,000 volts. So hold on to it. It'll be the thrill of your lifetime. You wouldn't be able to take it. Right? But that's the pleasure of Olam Hazeh. It says one moment of kairas ruach, one moment of satisfaction of Olam Haba is greater than all the pleasures of Olam Hazeh. So imagine what Olam Haba is like. That one moment of pleasure in Olam Haba is greater than all the pleasures of Olam Hazeh. But the Mishnah continues and says, Yafeh shah achas shel tshuva masan toilam b'olam hazeh, that one moment spent in tshuva and good deeds in this world is greater than all the pleasures of the next world. So how can that be? And in what sense is that true? In other words, if one moment of pleasure of Olam Haba is greater than all the pleasures of Olam Hazeh, now take all the pleasures of Olam Haba, everybody's Olam Haba, which is an eternity, and one moment of tshuva and mas and teiva in this world is better than that? How can that be? So the Baratanya writes, Tanya Perak Dalet, he writes that Olam Haba is pleasure. It's pleasure. It's passive pleasure. Chazal say it's tzaddikim yeshim, the righteous sit, atraseyim b'rasheyim, crowns on their head, v'nenemis of Ashchina, and they have pleasure from the radiance of the Shechina. They have pleasure. It's enjoyable. It's pleasure. But there's no growth. There's no achievement. There's no relationship. For a person who yearns to have a relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, the moment of doing a mitzvah is worth more than all that pleasure. That pleasure is pleasure. Maybe I could bring it out with a mashal that may illustrate the point aptly. There's a philosopher I quoted before. His name is Robert Nozick. And he's trying to make a point that there is more to life than the pleasure that comes from the things that we do. And he proved that in a very interesting way. He says, imagine a pleasure simulator. It's a machine, and you would lie on the bed, and they would hook your head up to a bunch of electrodes which would stimulate your brain and could simulate any type of pleasure in the world. So for example, you want to have the pleasure of winning the Nobel Prize? No problem. The person who operates the machine would just type it in a Nobel Prize, and you would have the simulated experience of being in Stockholm and receiving the award, and everyone would applaud, and you'd give the lecture, and all the newspapers, and everything, the whole experience, you would experience the pleasure of it. It would be a simulation, but you would feel the exact same pleasure because your brain was stimulated in the appropriate way. Then you want to have the pleasure of your wedding day, and you want to have the pleasure of the birth of your children, and you want to have the pleasure of a successful career, and the pleasure of a good meal, whatever pleasure you'd want. Just order it, and you have it. Okay, that's the pleasure machine. Now, if you had the choice to be hooked up, but to live a life where there was no genuine accomplishment, you wouldn't learn anything, you wouldn't do anything, you'd have no real relationships, you would have the pleasure of relationships. In other words, you could simulate the pleasure of being married, you could simulate the pleasure of motherhood or fatherhood, you could simulate the pleasure of having students, you could simulate the pleasure of, again, a career, whatever it is. But you'd know this one thing, that it wasn't real. It's only that you're experiencing the pleasure of it, not really doing it. Would you want to hook yourself up to the machine? Most people say no. Which proves that there is more to life than just the pleasure of certain experiences. In some sense, we want the experiences themselves. It isn't just we want the pleasure of the experience. We want the experience. We value the experience. This Olam Haba is pleasure. Olam Haba is the pleasure machine. Right? Tzadikim Yeshrim after saying Barashayim, the crowns are on their heads. They're enemies of Ashkina. They have the pleasure of the radiance of the Shekhinah. But there is no genuine relationship. There's no genuine avoda. So this is a serious problem. So if you're the type of person who is happy to have pleasure, then you'll go to Olam Haba willingly. But what if, Ahavti es Adaini, I love my master, that refers to Ribono Shel Olam, es Ishti, my neshama, ves Bana, my children, that's a metaphor for the mitzvahs and masim tovim, lo etech avshi, I don't want to go free. I don't want to go free. So there's a mechanism by which va'avado li'olam, you can be an eternal servant. And it says the Archaim an amazing thing. Now there's a Gemara in Masechah Sota, Daf Gimel, that says that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't die. Well, it says in the opinion he didn't die. So he says, Ma kan oimedu mishares, just like in this world he serves the Ribono Shel Olam, in the next world he also serves the Ribono Shel Olam. What does it mean he didn't die? It says he died. The Chaim says in Parshas Chukas, an amazing thing. It says by the death of Miriam and by the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, it says, Vatamas Shom Miriam, Miriam died there, and Vayamas Shom Moshe, Moshe died there. So the Chaim takes it to mean he died there. In other words, in this world he died. I mean, anybody that saw him would have sworn he's dead. Dead body. Looks dead. But that's only in this world. In the next world, he's alive. He's Omedu Mashamesh. He serves in the next world. There is a phenomenon, believe it or not, there is a type of Olam Haba. Don't ask me to explain this. There is a type of Olam Haba where it isn't just passive pleasure. It isn't just Tzadikim Yoshmat Raseyim Barashayim. You actually have an opportunity somehow to serve even in the next world. I don't know what that means. I'm just saying what he said. And that's the idea that the person who says, I don't want to go to the next world, I don't want to die, because I don't want this to end. So for him, for that person, the Ribono Shel Olam has an Olam Haba, which is Va'avodo Li'olam, where you can serve the Ribono Shel Olam forever, even in Olam Haba, whatever that means. It's a fantastic Archaim. I mean, it's just incredible how he reads this parsha. But the main point I want to take out of this is this one fantastic thing, that what you work for is yours forever. In other words, if you are a Baal Isha, if you create that neshama through your effort, then the Yatsa Ishto Ima, that's never taken away from you. Even by the Tchias Mesim, you'll have that. In Madonavi Ten Lo Isha, that which is just given to you gratis, is not really yours. You won't have it after the Tchias Mesim. I think this is something we all need to hear. You know, we all like the idea of getting something for nothing. Right, don't we? Right? It's a nice thing to get, you know, something effortlessly, it comes to you, it's given to you on a silver platter. But the reality is that those things in life that come on a silver platter, ultimately, you don't have. There's no permanence. It's not part of you. The things that you've worked for, the things that you've achieved, the things that have come with difficulties, those are the things that are in Baal Isha. If you're the owner of it, if you've acquired it, you've made it yours, then it's yours forever. But if it's Madanavi Tin Lo Isha, something given to you gratis, then it's not yours, it's not part of you. You don't take it with you. That's something we have to know. Let me share with you a thought. I was a little bit late in this. There's an amazing thing in Parshas Beshalach. It says when the Jews came to a place called Mara. So it says that they traveled for 3 days, they didn't find water. Finally got to Mara, the waters were bitter. So they came to Moshe, what should we drink? So Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, he showed him a piece of wood. The piece of wood was from a very bitter tree. Different opinions, whether it was an olive tree or a fig tree or the yardufni, different tree, but whichever it was a bitter piece of wood. And Moshe threw it into the water, and somehow the water became sweet. The Ramban says this was a nes b'soch nes. This is a miracle within a miracle. Because normally you want to sweeten something, you add sugar. You add something sweet, it becomes sweet. But here you have bitter water, you throw in something bitter and it becomes sweet. That's a compounded miracle. And that is a demonstration of divine power. Now Chazal tell us that when it talks about water in this parsha, it's a metaphor for Torah. The Chazal are commenting on the first verse. It says that they went 3 days and they didn't find water, so they became weary. So Chazal say this was the basis of the Takonas Chacham, of the rabbinic ordinance, to read the Torah on Mondays, Thursdays, and Shabbos. You should never go 3 days without Torah. Because this year they went 3 days without Torah, it was a catastrophe. So we see that that's the maximum. 3 days without Torah is a calamity. So apparently they understand that water here is a metaphor for Torah. We know from Chazal water is a metaphor for Torah. But Chazal don't explain the continuation of the parasha. So what is the hemshech? What follows? That they don't bother. They just focus on the first verse. But let's take it a step further. So they came after 3 days. There was no Torah. And when they arrived, the water was bitter. So what do you think that means? Well, it's pointing out to a truth that Chazal tell us. Chazal tell us about the Torah, Im ta'azveini yoyim, yoymayim me'ezvek. If you leave me for a day, I will leave you for 2 days. And the Mepharshim said like this, that let's say you walk away from the Torah. So you think that the Torah is stationary and you're walking away from it. No, the Torah is walking away in the opposite direction. It's not you walk away from it, but it stays where it is. If you walk away to the east, it walks away to the west. Now you're twice as far away from it. Very hard to come back. Very hard to come back. You know, I know in my own life that you probably think that, I have no problem. It's easy for me to sit down and learn, just it's like that. I got to tell you the truth that it is very, very hard for me. It's very, very hard. A lot of distractions, a lot of things that are calling for my attention. And sometimes you get a little bit out of the groove. It's very, very hard to get back. Very hard to get back. And this is something you have to know. So if you travel 3 days without Torah, and you want to come back, what do you discover? Lo and behold, it's bitter. It's bitter. It's not like absence makes the heart grow fonder. It's the exact opposite. And you go away for 3 days, you come back, it's very bitter. It's just there's no there's no taste. It's oof. Can't take it. So what's the solution to the problem? So Rabbi Shmulevitz writes in this parasha, he does an amazing thing. So people think the solution to the problem is to sweeten it. Okay, so what do you have to tackle? A difficult thing like Gemara? No, Gemara is hard. Take something nice and light, something easy, it's sweet, you read some Torah stories, it will be good. And this will help you. So Reb Chaim said that's not the solution. Just like Chazal say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is merape mar b'mar. He cured the bitterness with bitter. Says a person in life, when he faces that bitterness, just has to bite the bullet. And you have to be merape mar b'mar. You have to heal bitter with bitter. And if you do that, and you grab the bull by the horns, and do the things that are difficult, then it will become sweet. But you can't use artificial sweetener. You can't use saccharin or aspartame, one of those things, and think it's going to work. In other words, you're facing the bitterness, you just have to grapple with the bitterness. But if you do that, if you have the strength to do that, then it becomes sweet. And that is the type of thing that becomes yours forever. It cannot be taken away from you. In other words, if you sweeten it artificially, then you haven't earned it. It's not your creation. And those are the things that are fleeting. The things that you work hard for, those are the things that are your possession.